This is Teacher's Corner by Stenhouse Publishers. In today's episode, Sara Kugler, author of Better Book Clubs, is interviewed by her friend and colleague Grace Choi, an educator in Northern Virginia. Listen in as Sara and Grace share their perspectives on the benefits of book clubs both in and beyond the classroom. Whether you're a book lover, a book club pro, or just curious about getting started with book clubs, you won't want to miss this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Choi. I am a literacy resource teacher and coach here in Northern Virginia. And today I'm so excited to be talking with Sara Kugler, author of Better Book Clubs, Deepening Comprehension and Elevating Conversation. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Grace.
It's so good to be here together today talking about your work. And I'm so excited about this because I have just learned so much from you over the past many years, just from professional development that you've led and projects that we've been able to work on together. So I'm so excited to have your book, like this physical representation of your thinking that I can refer to again and again and share with others. So selfishly, I'm like really excited to have that. And just because like I love book clubs so much. And I feel like especially like during the pandemic and during that quarantine time, book clubs were such a lifeline for me and for my kids. I just remember my son, who was 10 at the time, when he was in 5th grade, like most parents, we were trying to find a way to like have some structure in our day and keep some sort of connection between home and school and friends. And one of the things that they had done like just before school shut down was they had finished up a book club on Kwame Alexander's The Crossover. And so like very naturally, one of the next steps that we could do is like some parents and I set up a little virtual platform. And they decided they wanted to read another book of Kwame's booked, and they just like kind of got it going. Like once we set up the space for them, they knew how to get that up and running because of all the work that they had done, not only that school year, but like in the years past in like 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade. And that's because of like so much of the work that you've done with schools and teachers and kids here in our district. So I'm so excited that this gets to go out into the world. And then also like for me personally, you know what an extrovert I am and how I'd always need to be around people and like talking. And so being in quarantine was like really hard. And one of my neighbors decided to start an outdoor book club in our backyard. And that was like the best part of being home for so long and having like this book that we would read together and get together every month to talk about. And to have that connection was like so important. And it was one of the very few things that like gave me hope and something to look forward to during a really like bleak time when it was hard to connect with others. So I'm obsessed with book club. I know you are too. And I'm so excited that we get to talk about it today.
I feel like we've talked a lot about how book clubs are so important in our lives outside of school, that we've both been members of book clubs forever. And I have this vivid memory of during the shutdown, one of the things that was like keeping me afloat emotionally was that I just asked a teacher, can I just keep meeting with one of your book clubs? And it was one of the most meaningful things that I was a part of. I felt so connected to those kids. And there were a lot of things that felt like that year that they weren't going well virtually. Mm-hmm. And it just, we couldn't do over the computer. And yet book clubs felt like very natural to do. Right. And yeah, they, at the end of the school year, at the end of 2020, they asked to keep going over the summer. We met throughout July and August, this group of 4th graders and I, through July and August twice a week. And we just found online books and did that. It's really a special thing that it works in the classroom, it works in person, it works virtually, it works outside around a campfire, which is how I did it a couple of times that year.
Totally. And it's like so much more than just about that like one book that you're reading.
Yeah. Well, it just makes me think so much about like the club identity, you know, like the book club that I was first started when I first got out of college, like we had this very strong identity. We were all 22, 23 years old, you know, but we like named ourselves after the first book we read and we had all these rituals. I mean, people dropped out of our book club because we were too ritualistic, but Some people might call that type A, but we had such this strong club identity. And so much of, I feel like the work I'm trying to do is trying to like teach kids how to feel a part of that.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about like your own experience with starting book clubs, like as a young 20 something. Tell me a little bit about like how you got to this work as an educator.
When I really think about it, I think about my mom, who is still to this day part of a book club that she joined when I was 5. So almost 40 years ago. She's still part of it. It was all the kids that went to preschool together. All the parents started a book club. They still meet once a month. It's pretty wild. So I think I grew up understanding how a book club could create community, be like an intellectual place. And I have all these visions of like, the week before the club, my mom would stay up late into the night to try to finish the book, which is also realistic. And that became a part of my identity after college. After college, I really missed reading for pleasure or just reading at all because I was a new teacher. And so I just asked a bunch of my friends if they wanted to start a book club. And then I think one of the themes in my teaching life is that anything I'm doing has to have legs outside of school. Like I'm not really interested in doing something that they're only going to use in 3rd grade. Like it has to be generative enough that it's going to work outside of the context of this classroom. It has to work outside of the walls of the school. And so the idea of book clubs in a classroom always felt very meaningful, very authentic, because it was something that happened in the real world. So there are book clubs like you and I are part of that are just for pure enjoyment, but there's a million jobs where you need to read a text or understand an issue and then sit around and talk about your ideas. It's just a skill that has legs everywhere. In colleges, students are sitting around talking about what they just read. That happens in schools. A bunch of teachers will read something and talk about it. So it just felt like this is the format that is the most authentic we can get. That's how we should be teaching deeper comprehension and also how we could start talking in more meaningful ways. And then, of course, I had some great mentors that showed me how it might look in a classroom. Colleen Cruz was one of my mentors who really helped me get it set up when I was a 3rd grade teacher. And coming to Fairfax County, that was just such a fun place to experiment because there were so many of us who wanted to figure this out. So that's kind of how I ended up here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about like how this project, like this book came about.
So it's something that I would say I experimented with, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. I just wrote a blog post about the unsuccessful times recently. That's on my mind. But I was always experimenting with that as just a format. Like I don't teach book clubs. I use book clubs to teach as a classroom teacher. And then I think when I was designing these big like conferences with some of my colleagues in Fairfax County with you. And we were really designing a conference about how to differentiate reading in small groups. And I was in these classrooms where kids were devouring chapter books and obsessing over series or authors and handing them like a 24-page book and calling that reading instruction. It just did not feel right. It's not what they were reading outside of small group reading instruction. It's not what they were reading outside of guided reading. And it just got me thinking like, we can't just be teaching reading in these books that are just written for school. We got to be teaching reading in the books that kids really want to read, that they're reading when they go to the library, that they're reading at night, that they're reading outside of our lessons. So with the help of, a bunch of reading teachers from around the county who experimented with me, we started playing around with this idea of like, how do you teach all of that good work? How do you teach interpretation? How do you teach inference? How do you teach analysis? How do you teach academic discourse in the books that kids will naturally be reading, which are chapter books, series books, graphic novels? And that landed me to some of the ideas that are in Better Book Clubs.
I love that so much. Like, and that goes back again to that authenticity, right? And I always think about how like neither you and I are athletes, but we have children who are, right? And like from like going to watch their practices and their games, like we know how much they learn from like doing the thing, right, in a scrimmage in the game versus like just doing drill after drill, right? It all kind of comes together when they're scrimmaging, when they're playing the game. And it like starts to make sense and they get to use all those things that they've learned in those drills in like flexible, authentic ways.
Oh my God. I mean, you and I could do a sports analogy for really anything, but like, yeah, I could riff off of this for ages now. But the idea of like, so my husband also not didn't really play a bunch of sports, but he's now coaching. And so we just kind of talk shop in terms of like teaching slash coaching. And one of the things he learned by getting trained in coaching is every practice has like a play, practice, play structure. So basically what that means is every practice has to start with some like a scrimmage where they just like get it going. The coaches kind of stand back and observe and watch kids in the act of playing the game very authentically so that they can make decisions about what to teach. And then they pause the play and they set up some sort of little drill that gets the kids to practice one little part of that thing. They do the drill for 10, 15 minutes, and then they go back to play. Okay, let's put it back in action. And I was like, this is great teaching. This is book clubs too. You want to watch kids in the midst of discussing, or you want to watch kids in the midst of actually reading. You want to teach them something, little isolated thing that they can apply right away, and then you want to get them back to it. And there's so much that we can learn from sports coaching that also applies to great instruction, right?
Totally. Totally. Yeah. I love that. I love that. So talk a little bit about like the benefits specific to a book club versus like other forms of small group instruction.
I think the one that's the most meaningful to me is if we get it right, there is a sense of community and belonging. That feels the most important. That I don't know what it is, but just saying to a group of kids, your book club is meeting today has a different feeling than saying, guided reading group B, come on over. There's something different to it. So that there's this sense of community. I think there's, in my mind, when I'm really going for book clubs, there's more of a sense of ownership and independence on the kids. It doesn't mean that I'm not teaching. Of course, that whole like play, practice, play metaphor works because I'm doing some teaching. But there's something about kids having more ownership where they're responsible for starting the discussion. They're responsible for keeping the discussion going. If it flops, I'm not jumping in the second that there's silence to save it. So there's something about independence and building a sense of agency. And then there's also this whole thing about choice that, and I think this is the trickiest one. So I'm constantly trying to work with it. But, you know, I've been bringing my book clubs to our book room and saying, like, hey, look at these 5 books. Do any of these look good? Or even our 6th graders, they just have this rotating schedule where the 6th graders like come and shop for their own book club and like they know how to use the checkout system and they go back to their classroom. Like that sense of choice, I think, is so powerful because it also means that kids can pick their books and go, this is boring and abandon it. And that's okay too. And then they pick a new book. Like that is also authentic. So those feel like kind of qualities that aren't always present in some of my other small group instruction that sometimes feels a little bit more teacher led, feels a little bit less like I need you to be reading this type of text, so I'm going to choose it for you. So, yeah, it feels like a big shift. And I think kids feel that too.
Yeah, it feels so much like you're teaching readers versus teaching reading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's a place for both of it. Like I don't think they know that I'm teaching reading. I know that I am, but yeah, it feels so catered to those kids. I have to tell you this one story, which is I'm co-teaching in a 2nd grade class now, and I'm doing a book club with 2 groups of kids, 2 groups of 4 kids. And I've never had this before, but I ran into some of the kids at like a neighborhood basketball game, and I ran into some of the kids' parents at like Kiss and Ride at the end of the day. And the parents said, "Are you the lady who's doing the book club with my kid?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "Can't stop talking about it at home." Like, I've never had a kid go home and be like, "Guided reading, whew." Although, like, we do need that kind of instruction, right? Or like, my phonics teacher, what a dream. Like, we need good instruction around those things too, but, like, these kids are going home and being like, "I'm in a book club." And there's something that feels special about that to them.
Yeah. And it's like, it's very much like building their identity. And it like
Yes.
is so much more like sophisticated in terms of like the way that it's like packaged, but also like the work that you're doing. Um,
Yes.
so Sarah, tell us a little bit now, like who might this book be for in terms of like teachers? Like what are the different kind of entry points for teachers who might be interested in starting this work?
So, I'm gonna talk about, I think, who this might be for teachers, and then I'm gonna think a little bit about kids too. So, I think the way that I tried to write the book was, okay, if you do not have book clubs up and running yet, here are some logistical things that might be helpful to think about. I am 100% a structure person. I love a good schedule. I love a good routine. I couldn't possibly think about anything else before I thought about the logistics. Like, what is the structure of this? Where does it go? What's happening around book clubs? So I really started the book by thinking about that. Is like, if you've never done it, where do you start? But once we got that stuff out of the way, okay, it's up and running. There's also some stuff in there about I think it can start to feel a little bit like routinized and can start to feel a little stale. So, to me, academic discourse and comprehension is a never-ending continuum. It's not a rubric, 1, 2, 3, 4, you're done. It's not a check, yes or no. It's I'm learning how to do things as a reader now. You know, my friends at work are forcing me to read this fantasy book that, like, God, I hate fantasy, and, like, I'm having to learn how to read fantasy, and my 12-year-old's like, "That's a really typical archetype in that book," and I was like, "Alright, well, I didn't know that because I don't read fantasy," like, it's not a yes or no, I'm learning to read fantasy better. I'm learning to read reading research better this year than I ever have. So I'm always thinking about, okay, if your kids have gotten it up and running, what's a little bit more sophisticated work for them? And if you've got some advanced book clubs who have been doing book clubs for 3 or 4 years now, what's some really advanced work that a book club could be doing? So I tried to kind of put all of those resources because I know teachers are in very different points. And then if I'm really thinking about like who is this for in terms of kids, I think it's a pretty complicated answer. I don't want to make it sound easy. Um, I think if kids are really emergent readers, a book club is not going to be enough to teach them the world of print and phonics. But without discussion, meaningful discussion, what's the purpose? Why are we reading? It can start to feel like the drill. It can start to feel like reading is an exercise, or like how you were saying, the sports analogy can start to feel like we go to soccer practice and we just do drills around cones the whole time. So to me, there's a place for book clubs, even if it's not, you know, sixth graders sitting around a table chatting about the last 6 chapters they read. It could just mean that you make sure at the end of each text that kids read, there's some time for some student-led, teacher-facilitated discussion. So in that way, I do think it's for everybody.
And I really love the section in your book where you kind of talk about like that continuum and that gradual relief, right? Of like student-led independent book clubs might be the goal, and like here's how you might really get there. And especially like, I taught kindergarten for a long, long time. And you're right, we're not there have student-led independent book clubs in kindergarten.
Yeah, but
And
like, can you talk about what you did in kindergarten?
yeah, like we definitely would read a book. My kid loved turning and walking. They had like amazing, prolific things to say to one another. And we would often have like a whole class conversation after a book where they would just kind of engage in this discussion. And then you taught me, right, that one thing that we could do that feels a little bit more clubby is to take like two partner peers, pair them together, and just do a little talk club around that book. And in those talk clubs, like we got to hear a lot more student voices that perhaps like didn't feel like they could speak up in the whole group, but could speak in a smaller group. And they really had to learn kind of like that art of like negotiation and really deepen their conversation skills in the smaller talk clubs, because kind of more was expected out of each of them as a member of this little talks club. And so they were really like deepening that understanding of the book and like figuring out like, how do I talk to somebody about this? Like, how do I figure out what that back and forth is like and invite those voices in? We got into this habit in first grade of where kids they would constantly talk over each other, and they decided that the way that they were going to work it out was to play rock, paper, scissors. And you have like 17 games of rock, paper, scissors sometimes happening. But it was so cute. And it was kind of like their way of like approximating and figuring out like, how do I talk about books? How do I talk to somebody? And that's going to like build a foundation that's going to carry them on as they do more sophisticated work when they get to second grade and third grade and till they get to the sixth grade book club.
Which kind of reminds me, I was just watching a video of somebody who you taught with, Ashley Tingler, who's a first grade teacher. I was watching a video of her doing a hands down conversation or whole class conversation. Some people call it, you could even call it a whole class book club. Like that's another entry point in, is a book club doesn't have to be 4 people. A book club could be 17 kids, which is how Ashley was doing it. And 3 kids started talking at once, and a 4th kid said, you all need to work this out. And the kids said that. And I just thought, like, there's such a difference between how we were managed as kids, which is like, you have the talking stick, or these kind of like props, like you get 3 chips and each time you talk, you have to put a chip in the middle. And it's like, we spend so much time teaching the props when like the real work, talking about authenticity and like having legs outside of school is like, you guys got to work this out. Who's going to talk first? That's really authentic work. And so it doesn't feel like that's a problem to me. It feels like it's an opportunity for kids to learn how to negotiate that stuff.
One of the things that I love so much about that, and we just used your book to do a lab site in 5th and 6th grade at a school. And we did a lot of work around like interactive read aloud, doing some whole class conversation. And one of the things that was amazing was that like, as we were listening to each kid have this amazing whole class conversation, and they were in a historical fiction unit. So we read some historical fiction books that took place in Japanese prison camps in the US during World War II. And they had like so much that they want to talk about in terms of like racial injustice and then making connections to now. But what was so cool was that in those conversations, like I had no idea what their reading level was, how they scored on this standardized test, what their Lexile level was. It was just a really cool, authentic way to allow everybody to bring in their brilliance and kind of have that opportunity to talk without having to like do a task that might be hindering for some things or might limit others in terms of like, what they can or could write down. And it was just so neat to see like how much more came about because we were able to use talk as the way to think about, what they were thinking about.
I think the other thing that you're describing is another nice continuum for where to start book clubs, because it doesn't have to start with independent small group clubs. Another way that I talk about in the book is it could start whole group with a hands down conversation. And when that's an opportunity for the teacher to teach the whole class some stuff at once. And then how you're describing, it could then move into some small group clubs where you pair kids up and they talk about the read aloud so that the teacher can still kind of lift the level of comprehension. Kids still get to practice. The teacher can kind of float around coaching those different clubs. It's only the last step that's independent book clubs. Everybody's up and running on their own. But I don't get there every year. I don't get there with every age. Not every group gets there. But there's all these opportunities to teach that good stuff along the way, starting as young as kindergarten.
Yeah. What you're saying, Adam, this book is for everyone.
It's for every kid.
So yeah, and like there's definitely entry points for every kid, every teacher. And like, what are some predictable challenges that we run into?
One of the things I think about a lot is I'm learning to cook. I learned a few recipes during the pandemic, but before
Wait,
that,
you also always say that you're a bad cook, and you're not. Like
that's because I've only made you two things your whole life. It's the same two things,
last
pizza
book
and.
club at your house, we had really good lentil soup too.
All right. Well, that's one of my two recipes. But anyway, so so Alex, my husband, in the kitchen, he riffs. I know a lot of people like this, that like have a vague idea of a recipe, but what they're really doing is like, I know the types of things that go together, and I know that if it's too sweet, I can add some acid to balance that out. And I know that if it's like too liquidy, I can thicken it up with cornstarch. He kind of has these like if then in his head, that if these are the predictable problems with cooking, he's got ways to respond. And that really just got me thinking that like when kids show me some problems or struggles or challenges, that to me is not a sign that they're not ready. That's the sign that I can respond with some teaching. So I rarely think of it as like, oh gosh, this class isn't ready. It's just like, oh, there's the predictable problem. So one predictable problem that I always see every year in some form, in some class, is nobody will talk. And especially if you've got like a small group that's like a lot of introverts or kids who need a lot of processing time, kids will, I'm learning this in sixth grade too. They will wait you out for minutes and minutes and minutes. So oftentimes I just think, okay, if they're having a hard time starting, I need to teach them how to use their reading time as a way to prepare for launching the discussion. So I just taught a group of sixth graders how they can actually do some jotting as a way to think, okay, what's worth talking about with my club? If I get an idea as I'm reading, I'm going to jot it down, and then I bring my Post-it to the club so that we're not sitting there thinking of ideas in the moment. Another thing that's happening in second grade is everybody wants to talk at once. So I have done some work around teaching kids how to read body cues of like, if somebody's leaning in, if somebody, adults do this too, if they take a big breath, if they, even though we're not raising hands, sometimes adults will still be like, I got something to say. So teaching kids how to look for those signs that say that one of their friends has something to say. And I've been doing a lot of work in this second grade class about teaching kids how to monitor their own voice. It is something as an extrovert, you will also know. It's like, we do this at meetings too. Do you ever leave a meeting and you're like, why did I talk so much?
Yeah,
God.
and at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I'm like, why did I see that? I talked too much.
I know. So it's just like teaching kids to do that same thing. Like, have I said enough? Am I making space for quieter voices just that need more processing time, things like that? And then the other thing that feels really true is a predictable problem is kids will retell and not bring ideas to the table. That I would say is one of the most predictable things I'm seeing in like all grade levels right now, is they start the conversation just by like retelling the book. And so if I'm seeing that, then I know that I need to teach them how to develop an idea. So I just teach something like, hey, one thing you can do, we all read the book, we all know what happened. You can pick a part that was particularly interesting to you. You can do a quick summary of that part and then push yourself to say, what did it make you think, feel, or wonder? So just like getting them out of the literal retell and into some discussion worthy comments.
Right.
Yeah. What are you seeing in kindergarten?
I think like definitely what you were saying, like that retail, and like that always used to like bother me a little bit, because I'm like, oh, like we're working on like such deep thinking skills, right, beyond just this like literal retail. But then I was like kind of thinking about like conversations that I have like with my book club, or after I watch a movie or a TV show, and like I was noticing, oh, I do a little bit of a retail as a way to like launch into why I want to talk about that part. So I had to like let that part go, and then like just like you were saying, be like, yeah, and then like when that happened, like, why do you think this character did that? Or like, what did it make you think of?
Yeah, one of the things that I've done with groups of teachers when I'm doing some learning around book clubs is we read a text on our own, and then we come together, during our team planning meetings or whatever, staff development, and we have a book club, they have a book club, and I take a transcript. Because a lot of the things I've noticed that we critique in kids is present in our own conversation. So like one of the an example of that is kids will bounce around a lot around ideas before they settle on one. And we will look at them and think, nobody's listening to each other. They're not staying on topic. They're all over the place. But if you actually look at like the transcript of, we bounce around a while until we land on an idea that we want to talk about. That's just how conversations go. So that retelling example, that's really helpful to like take a transcript of your own book club and then analyze it. What are some of the things that you're doing that you could teach kids to do to keep it really authentic?
Yeah. And I think that also speaks to like the work that we have to do as teachers too, to like make sure that what we're asking kids to try, that like we've also experienced as well, right? So that we can like celebrate alongside them and also like live in some of that struggle. So whether it's like a teacher book club or like participating in one outside of school, I think that's so helpful in knowing like, what do I do? What happens? And I also think it's really helpful to have these predictable challenges in mind to know that like, yes, like book clubs can be like magical and it's not going to happen like overnight.
Right.
And so thinking about like, what are the things that are predictable challenge? And then like, what do I do? I think it's really helpful to know like, we can figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, you really have to play the long game, I think. Because I think my first year, I tried to launch book clubs in October in third grade. And like, whew, it was hard. It was hard. But it was because I hadn't put the building blocks in place. I just wanted it to all be up and running. And that's sometimes realistic, but it's not always.
For sure. So I know that you and I like work in a lot of schools where we have populations of kids who are just learning English, right? And kids who are often reading below grade level. How might kids who are just learning English or struggling to access grade level text, like how might they participate in book club?
This is another one of those really complicated answers because it feels like there's so many variables and there's so many different ways to support them. So I'll give you a couple of examples of groups that I'm working with right now. If kids are new to country, which we work in schools where there's a lot of kids who are new to country, one option is this read aloud club where the teacher can do an interactive read aloud and the kids can talk about the book that the teacher has read to them. And they can talk in their home language or they could talk in English. For a lot of kids who are new to country here, at my school that I'm working at right now, they just turn and have a discussion about the book in Spanish. And they all understand each other. And like, I do my best to pick things up. And maybe there's a couple kids in that group who are bilingual who like help translate for me a little bit. But that's less important than the fact that they're talking in Spanish about the book. So the beauty of that is that I can use beautiful picture books that don't have a ton of words, right? I don't know. They could talk about Elephant and Piggy. They could talk about Journey, that wordless picture book. There's a million ways that can go, but that's one option for kids who are really new to country and who are just starting to speak English. But I have kids, multilingual kids, who are not new to country, but who are comfortable speaking their home language. And so they read a book in English and then they process it in kind of like Spanish English back and forth because that's what everybody in the group is speaking. So I'm not trying to monitor them to make sure that they're only speaking in English. They're trying to communicate their ideas. I can teach that in whatever language that they want to speak. But I think the bigger belief that's underlying all of this is that I'm not waiting for them to be ready for book clubs. My underlying belief is that kids are ready. And the image I always have in my mind is of my own kids at like 2 years old, 3 years old at the dinner table, rarely do parents say, my kid is not allowed to speak at the dinner table because they're not ready to participate in the conversation. You would not hear a parent say that. You open up the discussion and kids participate in whatever way they can participate. And so if that's our underlying belief about how that's how kids acquire language is by listening and also participating in any way they can, that's also my belief in a classroom. That it might be 2 to 3 word sentences. It might be pointing at a picture and turning to their friend and saying it in Spanish, and then the friend translates it to English. There are so many ways if we are open and flexible to them participating. And then I also think about how the book club is also the format through which I teach vocabulary to English learners. So, for example, I was working with a book club in 6th grade. They're reading The OK Witch, and they were grappling with how to describe Moth, the main character. And I just gave them the word outcast. Have you ever heard of the word outcast? She's kind of an outcast. She's like an outsider. So that's just the perfect opportunity for me to introduce some more sophisticated vocabulary and to attach it to a concept that they already have.
Right. So it's like, it's even more responsive and timely because like it's going to stick because they're already talking about it and you're providing that vocabulary for it.
They need that word. It's like there's no more beautiful time to teach a vocabulary word than when somebody is like grappling and searching for the word to describe their thought, right? So I said, she's like an outcast, she's an outsider. And one of the girls said, if there's outsiders, are there insiders? And I was like, yeah, that's a real thing, insiders. So then for the rest of the book, they were trying to describe like, who are the outsiders, who are the insiders, and how are they positioned in these different groups, right? They needed the language. So that's a perfect time to teach them.
Yeah. We just had at that lab sit that I was telling you about, we noticed that where there was a kiddo who was new to the country last year. And so his like receptive language was much higher than his expressive language, right? So he could like understand and access like what the teacher was reading in this picture book. And then when she turned to talk about it, his expressive language was then still in Spanish. And so it was so cool to see like he was accessing it and he just needed to talk about it in a language where he could like really express what he was thinking. And I just love like the choice and like the opportunity that we offer kids, and we like let go of our constraints and say like, do what feels right for you. And we don't get in the way of that.
Yeah, last year I co-taught in a 5th grade classroom where we had 7 kids who had arrived since 2020. So new to the country since the pandemic. So this was like their first full year in school. And it got me thinking, just watching this teacher teach so masterfully. It's like, whose job is it to meet them where they are? Is it their job to acquire our language and meet us where we are so that we understand them and we're unwilling to understand them until they meet us where we are? Or is it our job and all the other English language learners in the room, is it all of our jobs to like move ourselves to work to try to understand what they're trying to communicate as well? Just got me thinking about that a lot. And book clubs is an opportunity for like us to move and meet kids where they are.
And like, what a great way to like infuse that sense of like identity and belonging with like every kid in your class, right? And instead of being elitist and being like, well, you're not ready for book club, they're not for you. Like, let's find a way to make it for everyone. Yes. So can you tell me like your favorite story about a book club and a memory that you have with kids?
Oh my gosh. Well, one thing that was really special was I was new as a literacy coach, and I was just getting book clubs up and running. This is years and years ago. And I was just piloting it in a classroom and trying to get some stuff going. And we were reading Beast Quest. Do you know that series, Beast Quest? It's like the least, I would not have picked it, but these boys were obsessed with this. It's like my worst nightmare. It's like fantasy and like animal fighting, whatever. And I was having like a really hard time connecting with this group. And two of the boys came up to me after we had read the first Beast Quest, and they said, we know that we meet with you with book clubs in school, but we all live in the same apartment building, and we're wondering if you would mind if we took the books home and just met on our own a couple of times without you. And like, I mean, it was probably 10 years ago at this point, and I just was like, that's it. That's it. That is the goal. They see their work as operating without school, without a teacher, without their dumb little folder of resources that I had made them. It had nothing to do with us anymore. It was, we have our book club up and running, and they checked out a whole bunch of more Beast Quest books and went home and started meeting outside of school. And like, that's the end goal. If nothing else, I want kids to have a strong identity. I want kids to feel a sense of ownership. And then one other story that actually didn't involve me, it was during lab sites. I was watching another teacher coach a book club. And in the middle of this book club, the teacher was like really leaning in to try to facilitate. And one of the girls turned to the teacher, a 5th grader, and goes, "Can you lean back? It's really hard for us to talk to each other when you're leaning in." And all of the coaches around the room like gasped, because that's also it. It's like, we can do this without you. Can you just show us with your body language that you trust us to do this? And it's those little shifts that I'm really looking for. And like, the day that I can't even say to them who wants to start because they just start and they're off and running and I can't even get a word in, that's the day I buy myself something nice or something, or I just
that's a little treat. Yeah. I just like my daughter and like her best friend at school this year, they started a little book club on their own, and that's what they spent us doing, is they both really wanted to read this book. They had 2 copies at the library, and so like that's what they did, and that made like my mom and my teacher are so happy that like, 1, they're choosing to read, and like 2, they feel so empowered to know how to do this and like to spend time doing it, because like they believe in it and they believe in themselves as readers and they see the benefit. I just love it so much.
Better Book Clubs, Deepening Comprehension and Elevating Conversation by Sara Kugler is available now from Stenhouse and other retailers. Keep up with Sara and Grace on Twitter at Sara Kugler and at Grace K. Choi. Check out stenhouse.com, where you can find blogs, podcast archives, book previews, and more. If you haven't done so already, please consider leaving a review for our show at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever podcast player you use. It means a lot. And if you've done so already, thank you. Please share this episode with friends and colleagues who you feel could get something from it. And as always, thank you for listening.